Today we're exploring the worst type in each of the 9 generations. It's key to know that each type has good Pokemon in each generation, so the basic guidelines for how we determine the worst is how the Pokemon with the type succeed. How are they held back by the typing? How much of their success is due to other factors? How much do they succeed in spite of this type? Of course, much of this is dependent on the tools given to each type, or else we'd have a solved, numbers-based game of most weaknesses defensively, least super effective hits offensively, and so on. We'll also be exploring how types have been knocked down from their previous stature. Now, without further ado, we're jumping into the first choice, which is fighting for Gen 1. Gen 1 is inordinately ruled by Psychics, so one might initially think, yes, of course fighting is the worst Gen 1 type. But then you think, wait a second, poison types are also weak to Psychic, while fighting types at least have the benefit of packing Stab that crushes that other dominant type of Gen 1, Normal, super effectively. Then you look at what works in OU and you see that the poison type Gengar is a metagame defining Pokemon, and Victory Bell is a serious threat, having itself been OU proper on multiple occasions. Both Pokemon even have niches in Ubers, the land of Mewtwo, whereas the best fighting type by far, Machamp, which is tied for the highest attack stat in the game, wound up being so bad it's useless even all the way down in NU. So what gives? Every Gen 1er ever has at some point thought they would be the one to finally crack the code on Machamp. There's no way you can't get some utility out of the only Pokemon in the game to hit Tauros, Snorlax, and Chansey super effectively, right? Oh, and that's not all, as Machamp's fighting stab also super effectively clocks OU mainstay Cloyster and Rhydon. Turns out, the reason every Gen 1er has gone the way of those that came before them, dismissing Machamp as garbage, is because there's also no way you can actually get Machamp to consistently land those fighting hits on its normal targets. Blanked so thoroughly as it is by the omnipresent Psychics, and similarly shredded by the Tauros tier terror Zapdos. Machamp just doesn't have the tools to break through them, at least not relative to how difficult a time it has switching in the first place. It's bereft of useful resist and is decidedly uninspired in the bulk department, and even in the unlikely event it does get to face off against one of its desired normal targets that have nowhere to turn, Machamp's fighting hits are so paltry it still may very well come up short. Submission is 80% accurate, deals 25% recoil damage, and still only musters 80 base power for the trouble. It can't even one-hit KO Chansey. Alternatively, it can go with low kick, which has a neat 30% flinch rate, but fails to 2-hit KO Tauros and isn't even fully guaranteed to 3-hit KO Snorlax, while it will just about never 3-hit KO Rhydon or Cloyster, neither of which submission is favored to 2-hit KO either. Again, this is the best the fighting type can muster in Gen 1. Machamp is bad, the rest are just pitiful. You're better off using Rhydon, which may lack the super effective stabs, but has an easier time hitting the field, actually useful defensive value, and is much better at making its hits sting offensively, as nothing actually comfortably switches into it. Meanwhile, the poison type does nothing for Gengar and Victory Bell. They would be much better as Mono Ghost and Grass types respectively, rid of their psychic weaknesses and gain an Earthquake neutrality, but they're so good they succeed in spite of the poison type, providing only downsides. The fighting type, on the other hand, doesn't just have actual upsides, but packs some of the best advantages one could ask for, and how it uniquely threatens some of the best Pokemon to ever be OU. And yet, it can't accomplish anything. Poison types offer nothing for being poison, but you can succeed with the Pokemon they burden anyway. Fighting types offer something and deliver nothing. They wouldn't be the only later gen powerhouse type with such lowly beginnings though, as in Gen 2, it was the Dragon type. But before we talk about how bad Gen 2 Dragons are, here's a word from our sponsor, the GOAT, Surfshark VPN. A VPN, or a virtual private network, is a server that you can connect to that encrypts not only your private data, but also your location. You can even use this to pretend like you're in another country. Now, why would this come in handy? Well, with streaming services like Netflix, you're often region locked. For example, if I were to vacation in Japan, where there are no subtitles on my anime, I could use Surfshark and change my VPN back to the US or vice versa, and now I have American Netflix wherever I go. You can do this with multiple countries because Surfshark has over 4,500 plus servers in over 140 countries. You supercharge any streaming service you have by doing this. And of course, being a VPN, Surfshark keeps your outgoing data encrypted and safe. For example, I travel a decent amount, which means I'm often at the airport and need to use the Wi-Fi to keep track of my spending, because sometimes I go overboard on overpriced meals. But people on the public Wi-Fi at the airport could be lurking to access some of my sensitive data. But thanks to Surfshark, I just boot it up and my data is safe and secure. And one of the best features that separates Surfshark from the other VPNs is that you can use it on unlimited devices. That's right, no additional subscriptions required. You can put it on all of your devices, and there's no risk thanks to their 30-day money-back guarantee. So if you want a sick VPN and also support the channel to help us produce more content, you can click the link in the description below and go to surfshark.com/fallswipe or use code fallswipe at checkout to get 4 extra months of Surfshark VPN. In Gen 1, being a dragon was also generally worse than useless. Having a quad ice weakness when everything tossed around blizzards and ice beams was appallingly bad, but at least it did have the benefits of making Dragonite a flying type neutral to Zapdos' mighty Thunderbolts, unlike the usual trade-off made for being immune to Earthquake. However, in Gen 2, the arrival of Hidden Power meant Electrics came equipped with Hidden Power Ice to target the electric-resistant grass and ground types, and thus Dragonite's electric neutrality wound up amounting to very little. Sometimes Zapdos and especially Raikou would run HP Water instead, but even there, Dragonite doesn't actually threaten them very well. In the case of Raikou, Dragonite finds its learn set mysteriously missing Earthquake. Not being able to take on the legendary Electrics is hardly the harshest indictment, but the problem is more than Dragon's added on Ice weakness, which is more exploitable than ever for Dragonite. In addition to HP Ice, Gengar's also packing Ice Punch now. After all, the new Dragon Kingdra is neutral to Ice and Electric, and just about everything else, barring the Water and Fire it quad resists, and its one weakness, Dragon. And this brings us to the heart of the issue. Kingdra still isn't that good, despite its sole weakness being to Dragon, precisely because it never has to worry about that weakness being taken advantage of, as Dragon fails to actually provide sufficient positives in return. Its water resist is useful, true, but it doesn't actually do much with its water resist. Since yes, Dragon has been given an actual stab move now, but it's the 60 base power Dragon Breath, which is more used for paralysis spreading than actual damage. You would literally do more damage with Hidden Power Dragon, which is not to say that you would actually do damage with it. Kingdra and Dragonite have their good points, but the Dragon part is incidental, if not an active hindrance. Dragonite would actually be better as a normal flying type, gaining stab extreme speed and being able to pull off an actually unique curse set for it, while only having a singular ice weakness would allow it to better withstand Gengar and even Jinx. And even with the electric weakness, it still survives Zapdos' Thunder, so it's functionally not that different a matchup. Losing the water resistance doesn't functionally change much. If anything, being much less terrified of ice, as well as having actual stab, would be much more of a game changer. Even becoming fighting neutral would be worth the trade-off, because in a trade-off, you're supposed to get something in return. Being Dragon in Gen 2 doesn't actually do that. Meanwhile, Kingdra's problem is one of move pool. The typical Dragon move pool would work wonders on its own in later gens, but here it leaves Kingdra with next to nothing. It isn't bad, but it's passive, which, other than the overly specific niche of completely walling Vaporeon, leaves it to get overshadowed by the greater stats of Suicune or the more impactful moves of Vaporeon or Starmie, even though they have an actual electric weakness. Now, the less balanced early gens made things easier, but we're going to have a tougher time now with everything introduced in Gen 3, where our selection is with Poison. Now, this is potentially going to seem a little strange, considering Gengar is one of the most elite Pokemon in OU, and indeed, the Poison type making it toxic immune helps it out quite a bit. However, the Poison type as a whole, while certainly with its upsides, generally plays second fiddle, and even the mighty Gengar, the only Poison type to rank OU in Gen 3, isn't above the reaches of its flaws. In spite of the Steel and Dark types put in place to nerf them from their peerless Gen 1 peak, Psychics were still dominant at this point, and the methods used to contain them tended to be just barely sufficient. For instance, Pursuit still being a special move made it quite a specific choice. So what of Poison's upsides that made this weak spot often targeted by metagame staples Jirachi, Celebi, Starmie, Claydol, and Metagross worth the effort? Well, it certainly wasn't stab, at least not in the case of Gengar, which brandished a mighty special attack and 2 physical stabs, meaning its sludge bombs would deal pitiful damage even against its few super effective targets. Even the poisons with better attack stats were generally not especially prized for their stab, easily resisted as they were, if not outright blanked by steals that wouldn't even fear the 30% poison rate, though they weren't helped by set attack stats, not really rising above the status of decent. In Gen 2, you actually saw some poison stab in OU, wielded by Swords Dance Tentacruel, but that was in a time of much more limited offense. With the wide expanse of the advanced generation, it no longer stood out. So Poison wasn't doing it offensively, and defensively it wasn't much better off, because in addition to getting ruined by Psychic, it also had a crippling weakness to Earthquake. Gengar was an exception, thanks to Levitate, as was the occasionally used Wheezing, thanks to the immunity to not just Earthquake, but also Spikes and Arena Trap. They had actual tools to use though, because Crobat also shared these qualities and incredible speed, yet packed a pitiful move pool which rendered it utterly useless. Poison's main defensive quality was a fighting resistance. While useful, fighters weren't yet such a dominant force that this was sufficient to justify the flaws in and of itself, and in the case of Gengar, its ghost typing made it fighting immune, completely undercutting the resist. Meanwhile, Weezing and Venusaur, that other poison occasionally seen in OU, were useful, but didn't pack the recovery nor the immediate impact to really work in this role. Poison's other resists were Bug, which was useful for resisting Heracross's Megahorn, with Gengar packing a dual resist, but not sufficient to make for a true Hera answer, nor was it particularly rare to resist Bug and Grass, the resist to which was almost useless considering the only Grass stab in OU came from Celebi, and was thus flanked by Stab Psychic. Basically, although Gengar is great and really does love that toxic immunity, it's also Gengar. For most everything else, the upsides might be neat, but poison typing relegates them to a place below the rest of the pack. It was a pretty cool existence, but unmatched in this frigidity was of course none other than the Ice type in Gen 4, where Ice's offensive upsides are more theoretical than practical, and thus aren't able to outweigh the very many real flaws doggedly dragging it down. Ice is known for its chillingly poor defensive traits alongside ferocious offensive firepower, but it gets burned in Gen 4 because it fails to bring the heat on the offensive end, leaving more of an idea of what could be instead of any tangible offense. Many a Gen 4 player has been let down by Weavile, which seems to crush everything on paper, just not actually hitting that hard in practice. Such are the perils of Stab Ice Punch, or what we might call Electivire Syndrome. High attack stat undermined by low base power stabs. OU's ice types, Weavile and Mamoswine, are both afflicted by this. Mamoswine's appropriately huge attack stat is plagued by an even weaker ice stab, Ice Fang, which means Adamant Mamoswine is hitting about as hard with its ice stab as Jolly Weavile, so not hard at all. Their saving grace is the excellence of priority Ice Shard, and Mamoswine especially has some neat tricks thanks to its half-ground typing, giving it beautifully complementary dual stab, an electric immunity, and a stealth rock neutrality, but by and large they are forced to primarily be other typed Pokemon while still suffering the flaws of their ice typing, taking the bad without the good. Such is the life for physical ice types existing in an age before real physical ice moves came to be. They would get major buffs eventually, but for now, they languish with the unfulfilled potential. Meanwhile, special ice types at least have the benefits of hitting hard with Stab Ice Beam. Glaceon's Ice Beam is as powerful as Kyurem's. The problem is that these other ice types are so severely lacking in other departments that though they get the good side of the ice type, they don't get enough to outweigh that they're receiving too much of the bad side too. The best of them, once again, doesn't operate as full ice types and are still held back by ice's weaknesses. Frostlass, before Snowcloak was banned, was basically a fast spikes machine that functioned as its own spin blocker with its ghost typing. Its ice typing pretty much just gave opponents more ways to hit it super effectively. Not that you needed such hits, given its non-existent bulk, but it didn't help. The ice type that most leaned into its ice typing was Abomasnow, unaffected by the hail it summoned, and abused both in terms of chip damage on nearly everything and in the fact that it would sometimes actually employ 100% accuracy stab blizzards. Additionally, its ice typing was actually a huge part of its defensive use, as the water resist of its grass typing is only as useful as it is because its secondary ice typing makes it neutral to the accompanying ice beams of those waters, which is incredibly rare and valuable. Meanwhile, offensively, its leech seeds land so nicely because would-be immune grass types are afraid of stab blizzard. Abomasnow is a legitimately decent Pokemon, in large part because of its typing, but like the others, has that same typing hold it back from making more of an impact. There were just so many weaknesses. Ice types were among the few Pokemon alongside Tyranitar and the occasional Aerodactyl to actually have a steel weakness pre-fairy type introduction. You couldn't bring ice to OU too much, as you were just asking to get beat up by Scizor, Infernape, and many others, setting yourself up to get walked over with lesser Pokemon in the face of Heatran, Jirachi, and friends. Ice would get better down the line, as opposed to the next choice's Fall of Grace finalized in Gen 5, where Normal fully fell off, made official by Snorlax's drop to UU. Previously, you could kid yourself into thinking Curselax could still do something. Stall teams used to account for it after all. Or maybe it could choice ban Pursuit or something, but no such delusions would be suffered here. Even the mighty Blissey, previously walling what felt like everything, even without resist, and its newly Eviolite Earring Chansey were swept away by the deluge of Weather Spam and Dragon types, to say nothing of the explosion of fighters, and just in case that wasn't enough, unstoppable hazard stacking, which really rendered them unable to withstand even Pokemon they'd otherwise take on. The extreme volatility of Gen 5 demanded bulky resists, or preferably immunities, where you could take them. Even the pink blobs couldn't withstand monstrosities like Rain, and Choice Specs boosted Keldeo Hydro Pump off of bulk alone. Even in instances where they weren't immediately threatened, their passivity was more glaring than ever, immediately taken advantage of at every corner by Ferrothorn. Gen 5 was so intense that, in addition to the greater specialization required to play defense, it also demanded aggression and more direct, immediate capabilities of these defensive pieces, lest they have circles run around them by the torrential swath of offense. Later on, Clefable would gain a niche, illustrating the power of the hazard-ignoring Magic Guard as it overwhelmed the mediocrity of its normal type, but only against certain bulkier team styles. Against powerful offense, it was blown away far more easily than Blissey and Chansey. This is just defense, of course. There is no sort of normal offense to be mustered anymore, unless you're counting Extreme Killer, Arceus, and Ubers, of course, but there are no normal types anywhere near such quality in OU, even discounting how ridiculously flawed the Pokemon themselves are, or how widely resistant their stabs would be, which is a lot to discount, by the way. The real issue is not hitting anything super effectively. Dragons, their closest relative in this regard, quote-unquote only hit other dragons super effectively, but this is a huge target, number one, as dragon Pokemon are much better now, and number two and number three, Dragon is only resisted by one type at this point, Steel, which in tandem with Draco Meteor's 140 base power alongside Outrage's 120, coming off of such meteoric, outrageous attacking stats, means they don't need super effective hits to melt the best Pokemon in the game. Sometimes even resist don't do the trick. Normal flounders in the dust so far beyond its status as top tier early on, but the next choice has been just a matter of time, and it cemented its place in 2 generations in the case of Gen 6 and 7 Bug. The type's so bad, during Generation 6, there was a genuine call to test its Arceus form in OU. Now, while Arceus Bug didn't wind up descending from Ubers to rain Pestilence down on standard play, the long-maligned Bug type found its nadir in Gen 6 and 7, in spite of the second and third times the charm of the monstrously broken Genesect, or early brokenness of Gen 7's Pheromosa. Not for nothing, the Bug type didn't exactly want for some sort of redeeming factor, with its longtime representative Scizor continuing its defining presence through its Mega, as well as Mega Heracross and Pinsir making splashes as well, though Pinsir didn't actually use Bug Stab, but still. And of course, Megas aside, Volcarona continued to be one of the most controversially powerful Pokemon around. Beyond these, the Bug type wasn't without buffs, as its longtime enemy Stealth Rock could now be dealt with more easily through the buff to Fog, and it actually got better over time. Gen 7 added cool new tools like Golisopod and its amazing priority move First Impression. It had more in its favor as well, Bugnium Z turning just about any bug move you wanted to into a powerful Savage Spinout. Ultra Stunning moves increased the Fog distribution, making it easier to keep Stealth Rock off the field, but every type got Z moves, and some of the Pokemon that most benefited from this easier Stealth Rock removal were also those that stifled the bugs, namely Tornadus Styrian and the Mega Charizards, to say nothing of how imperfect the practice of keeping rocks off the field continued to be. Beyond the double-edged sword of the Fog, bugs had more to deal with than ever because of 2 factors: lots of new fairy types, especially in Gen 7, and also in the latter generation, Toxapex. This was an exceedingly harsh environment for Bug-type offense. Even in the Toxapexless VGC, its coverage just wasn't particularly unique or impressive. Dealing with Psychic types was neat, but seeing as the Steel nerf had made Dark and Ghost much more powerful, this wasn't especially notable. Plus, the most popular Psychic was Tapu Lele, which was neutral to Bug thanks to its half-fairy type, which had been introduced in Gen 6 as yet another resist to Bug, which wasn't exactly slicing through the Steel, Flying Ghost, and fire-heavy metagame previously either. Yes, Volcarona, the best of the Bug bunch, was indeed one of the most powerful sweepers in the game, and it loved melting key targets like Garchomp with a +1 Z Bug Buzz, while sometimes it even enjoyed substitute sets to drop it into low HP so as to activate its Swarm ability and deal blistering boosted Bug Buzzes. However, Volcarona had been no stranger to dropping Bug Buzz in the previous 2 gens, and it had more of a reason to do so than ever, now with all the Pokemon it had to try to cram in coverage against. It wasn't just Volcarona either, but also Scizor, which, alongside its Mega, had long since been the emblem of Bug Stab in OU. Both Scizor and its Mega would occasionally drop it previously, but now OU's demands were such that they would seriously have to justify U-turn over the many other, often more pressing demands that were made upon its move pool, especially in Gen 7. And this isn't just Bug Stab, this is U-turn, whose switch move strength was such that it's been the cause of controversy across multiple generations. Even Mega Heracross, whose skill link Pin Missile outdamages even Megahorn, finds itself dropping Bug Stab. The same type Bug Swole never uses its Bug Stab, nor does Mega Pinsir. All this has been offensively minded, but defensively, Bug isn't doing too great either. The only one that really escapes unscathed is Mega Scizor, and that's because its Bug typing pairs so well with Steel, leaving it with just one weakness. For the others, it's amplifying other issues, pushing a Stealth Rock vulnerability to horrifying extremes, and or piling on a laundry list of other easily exploitable weaknesses. At least Bug resists fighting, but Toxapex and the new fairy types make it easier to do that than ever. Buzzwole's Roost and Great Bulk, acting as a sort of defensive Heracross, offers some promise, but it wouldn't really come into its own in this regard until Gen 8, when it no longer had a Mega Scizor to compete with. And yes, Mega Scizor didn't resist fighting like Buzzwole did, but again, that wasn't quite as valuable now. Mega Scizor competition aside, Bug resisting grass is newly valuable in the age of Tapu Bulu and Kartana, but it's also not that unique a trait either. Of course, the bugs have a lot to like, but they've also been flawed pretty much since the beginning, and it's finally come to a head here. Not exactly a shocker that this would happen at some point, which brings us to Gen 8 and 9, where a type that had long been overlooked for the excellence of the Pokemon wielding it finally had its flaws exposed with the Rock type. And that was of course Tyranitar, which finally had its fall from grace in the Scarlet and Violet metagame that viciously targeted its rock typing every which way, though it actually dropped to UU for the first time in Gen 8 for its lower utility in the wake of its removed pursuit, before rising back up to OU off the strength of its choice band set. Actually, its rock typing had long since been a weak point, but since it was such a major part of what made Tyranitar Tyranitar, and since Tyranitar was so good, for a long time it made the rock type seem better than it was, which is why it was regularly the only rock type in OU, including Gen 8, until Gen 9 when the flaws finally caught up to it. Of course, the rock type had a ton of benefits. Resist to fire and flying remain excellent today, as does the ability to hit them super effectively with stab, which is also useful against pesky bugs and the ever more dangerous ice types. Quite an impressive array of super effective coverage, mirroring the wide oppressive reach of Stealth Rock. Rock's normal resist is mostly a thing of the past, but whereas that part is outdated, Rock actually improved over time. As in Gen 4, it gained a +1 special defense boost in the Sandstorm, tailor-made by Tyranitar and its Sandstream, and later on Gigalith, though also wonderfully utilized by other rocks when paired with that other non-rock Sandstreamer, Hippowdon. Not that there was much of a problem pairing Tyranitar and another rock like Terrakion way back when. In addition to the defensive benefits, they might even double up on Choice Band Stone Edges, recalling the dual Choice Band rock slides of T-Tar and Aerodactyl that defined the Gen 3 OU metagame pre-Sand special defense boost. It seems bizarre to imagine 2 rocks on the team, when nowadays it's a stretch to even include 1. This isn't just the downfall of Tyranitar either, but more a problem with how Rock famously tends to not pair well with other types, even good ones. Whether rock waters like Amistar and Kabutops, or rock steels like Aggron and Bastiodon, or rock grounds like Rhyperior and Golem, Rock tends to leave its dual-type user littered with exploitable weaknesses, especially quadruple weaknesses. Tyranitar previously managed its dual fighting weakness alongside weaknesses to all of Water, Grass, Ground, Steel, Bug, and Fairy. 4 of those non-fighting weaknesses are exclusively from its rock typing, and it was worthwhile because of the insane support of its Sand and Pursuit. But with Sand no longer permanent and Pursuit removed from the game, it's left with its other qualities, which are no longer sufficiently impressive to outpace its many weak points. As much as one would wish Choice Band Tyranitar to be forever destructive, it managed it in Gen 8, but now it's not going to offer much of value at all unless it learns the Stealth Rock setting Stone Axe, which is an amazing move on paper, but isn't sufficient to elevate the Pokemon that learns it, Cleavor, out of lower tier mediocrity, which it dwells in despite having a Scizor tier stat spread thanks to the many flaws of rock typing attached to Bug. Non-Tyranitar rock offense hasn't been especially notable in a while, which is why it's also been some time since Terrakion has been an OU threat, even though it pairs so well with its secondary fighting stat. But even the seemingly up-to-date Paradox forms of Tyranitar and Terrakion, Iron Thorns and Iron Boulder, are rife with severe flaws on account of their rock typing, which drags their respective electric and psychic types down into the depths of myriad exploitable weaknesses without much in the way of offense as compensation. Consider the 2 rocks in OU in Gen 9. One is Glamora, whose job is to set hazards and feint at the start of the match, i.e. its playstyle isn't limited by the flaws of its typing. The same type, Nihilego, actually has great defensive promise, but is regularly let down by how Rock and Poison, in spite of some aspects to like, just ultimately made it too easy to target super effectively. Gen 9's other OU rock is Garganacl, whose superb bulk and recovery is not undercut because it is a mono rock type, meaning it can reap the benefits of its resist without being plagued by any dual weaknesses, but of course it thrives when it's terrassalizing into a fairy or a water type, while on the flip side, you're not likely to see any OU non-rock types terrassalizing into rock, which really cements its place as the worst here. That and the fact that rock type offense is just completely gone at this point. However, in a happy redemption arc that lets us leave on a good note, you are going to see quite a few terrassalize into normal. And thank you so much to our platinum patrons. Thank you to Amphozenus, Alex Sable, Anthony Belval Renault, Corman, Daniel Is Beast, Eric Dissing, Funky, Glitcherton, Howl, Jack G, King Yabber, Nightfall, Megamon VGC, Mojo Game Slayer, Nurse Jake, Pretzel SP, Soljiro Sakura, Spavoon, Skylaria, Soras and Croxon, Shiwei Miji, Stoneface Colin, Kiboflu, Wardine for their major support of our videos.